Today's talk will be on the solar weather and human health. This is also known as heliobiology, a new area of study. A systematic review of heliobiological studies of the last 25 years devoted to the study of the potential influence of space weather factors on human health and well-being was carried out in 2020-2021. The scale of the data sampling had three different factors. These are based on the years, the days, the hours, the level of the organization of the biological system, population, groups, individual body systems, and the degree of the system response, the norm, the adaptation, the failure of adaptation, such as illness, or disasters, such as death. So within this study that I have featured here, this published paper, we'll see that there's different effects that are applying from the space weather indices, such as an increased heart rate, so cardiovascular constrictions taking place, which is a big contributor for stroke and heart attack. So during geomagnetic storms, these potentials increase. The risk increases if you have certain health issues that apply to you, such as excess plaque in the arteries and different things that contribute to heart and cardiovascular issues. So during this period of a geomagnetic storm, which takes about 3 days to arrive at Earth after the event itself has happened. So we're looking at about 36 hours before the arrival of that impact from the solar wind. So within this period of arrival, there's also another period that precedes the flare itself. And recently, scientists have discovered that at Purdue University, by looking at a few different radioactive metals, manganese 54 in particular, and chlorine. The manganese 54 decays and it turns into chromium 54 and emits a gamma ray. Now this is taking place prior to the coronal mass ejection itself, and this is up to 39 hours before the flare disturbance is even detected. So as it's happening down in the core, that resonance is being felt here on Earth. The disturbance is already being felt 3 days before the flare even takes place. So this window around the solar flare is not only 3 days for impact for the geomagnetic storm after the solar flare. You also have a period of 3 days before the flare in which we'll start to notice these changes being triggered within our own biological systems. This effect is a quantum entanglement effect. The Earth has connections to the sun and different spots on the sun. We call these foot points. Now, there's different tools that we could use to look at these footprints that are provided by different national laboratories in solar physics. So as the Earth is orbiting the sun, these foot point spots are moving around the sun, and they like to jump to active areas of the sun or disturbance regions, such as solar flaring, sunspots, filament eruptions. Foot points will move to those areas on the sun as they're more active and they're drawing in the energy. Now these foot points are always there and they're always connected to the sun, kind of like a tethered Birkeland current or a tethered connection. And this allows the energy to move very quickly to the Earth. And like tugging on one end of the rope, you'll feel the other tug on the end of the rope immediately. So it is here on Earth, these different metals like manganese, are very sensitive to the changes that are taking place. So sensitive that they feel that tug days before the disturbance on the sun has even taken place, where we can visually observe it in the form of a solar flare or a coronal mass ejection. These coronal mass ejections are highly energetic particles, and when they interact with the Earth's magnetosphere, they're triggering the geomagnetic storms. These storms sometimes knock out our power grid, and they cause different problems with our electronic systems. The sun's activity is expected to peak during the cycle, where we call it solar max. That's part of this 11-year cycle. That's the most intense part of this cycle. Right now, we're currently in solar minimum, and we're moving towards solar max, which is going to take place here in just a couple years. We are nearing the end of solar minimum now and beginning to enter into solar maximum in 2023 and 2024. Some of these huge storm events in the past, like the Carrington event that hit Earth in 1859, they caused the telegraph lines that were laying on the ground to catch fire. These wires were glowing, and the aurora borealis appeared all the way to the equator. The Aboriginals have an interesting story they hand down concerning these aurora borealis coming all the way to the equator. And when they noticed these storms lighting up the sky, the chiefs would exchange their wives with their fellow tribes. This would prevent a war from taking place, because they knew the disturbance of the storm would cause them to lose their mind and their intellect. And that's very important, because what we're seeing now is during these events, like a geomagnetic storm, for example, your cognitive function is greatly reduced. And we're seeing these different effects of the brain acting erratic. So more emotional-based decisions take place during a geomagnetic storm. A person feels more moved to make that decision, irregardless of what the consequences are. So a lot of bad decisions are made based on the emotional state of the person. And this stress response from these geomagnetic storms appears to be mediated by the cryptochrome compass system. And this is a very interesting system. This is the light that comes out of your eyes. So we receive and generate light out of our eyes. And this cryptochrome process is mitigating the serotonin and melatonin levels as well, which are, of course, regulating our circadian rhythms, or our sleep patterns. So when we have a geomagnetic storm, this is demonstrating several factors affecting the human body. So it's important to be aware of these factors that are out of our control. This is kind of a natural disaster that's taking place. And it's hard for us to determine what it is that's taking place. We just make a judgment based on our emotional state of mind at that time, which tend to be more emotionally charged thinking. And this has everything to do with the Schumann resonance of Earth as a plausible biophysical mechanism for the human health effects of the solar weather. And the Neil Cherry article here I'm mentioning is a great article to take a look at. This has been out and available for quite a while, and several different people have referenced this particular material. And here we can see, these effects are higher blood pressure and melatonin, increases in cancer, reproductive, cardiac, and neurological diseases and death. So this is a major factor that's mitigating and modulating our health that we need to be aware of. See, the brain is an electromagnetic system, and it's synchronized by the Schumann resonance signal. The Schumann resonance signal provides a brain frequency range matching electromagnetic signals, providing the synchronization needed for intelligence. See, the intelligent brain has developed over hundreds of millions of years in the environment that has contained in the Schumann resonance signal for over 3 billion years. This Schumann resonance signal is globally and continuously available. The ELF modulated radiating signal sourced from tropical thunderstorms and propagating around the world in the resonant cavity created between the ionosphere and the Earth's surface. Human, mammal, animal, fish, bird, and reptile brains have evolved in a global environment containing the Schumann resonance signal. So their navigation, their magneto compass within their brain, that little bit of iron that's there that helps them guide them to their different migrational routes, these are all played into effect with the cryptochrome. So as a bird's migrating, it's seeing in its eye the light, if this makes sense. The light changes and it's seeing the north field and the south field, and it gives it a compass of direction. And this is visual. This is visually taking place for them and how they see. So many animals, even whales in the ocean, are using this same process, as well as humans. So when this light is disturbed by different solar flaring events, gamma ray bursts, cosmic rays, all these different factors are changing the variability of the light. So the light changes slightly, whether it's dimming or becoming brighter. A good example of this is during the darker nights of the month. Well, we're under a new moon, for example. There's not as much light radiating and especially reflecting from the moon during this period of time. That light that we get at night from a full moon disturbs our circadian rhythm. It makes us more energized and more awake because the light spectrum has changed. We're having more light. So entering the darkness of night to sleep to achieve that REM state can be inhibited by a fluctuation of light coming in. Now, not all this light's visible light, so we're going to see this as energy. And that energy change isn't visible through our eyes as we view it. We feel it more emotionally, becoming emotionally unbalanced than we would seeing anything. So like Dean Radin had mentioned in the last interview that I put up not too long ago, a few days ago, this effect affects people's moods, but it also affects things like their judgments and their decision-making processes and their intellect. So you can see how this would affect like the financial markets, for example. And there's plenty of evidence out there to show that the stock markets themselves are influenced by this positioning of the planets, by the solar activity that's caused by those planets positioning, because remember, the inner planets modulate the solar activity. So Mars, Venus, and Earth, and Mercury, especially Mercury, plays a major role with the disturbances that we see that we call sunspots. Now, these inner planets are modulated by the outer planets. So the planets like Jupiter have an effect. Jupiter's modulating the cycle, the 11-year cycle, because it takes approximately 11 years for Jupiter to go all the way around the sun. And the very center, the center of our solar system, is not the sun itself, but it lays in the photosphere of the sun. So as Jupiter comes into perihelion, which is the closest approach that it'll get to the sun, it pushes the barycenter into the atmosphere of the sun. And this drives the solar maximum cycle. So when Jupiter's at apohelion, which is the farthest away from the sun, that's when we're in our solar minimum cycle. And as Jupiter comes in for its closest approach, it drives and pushes the barycenter, the point where all the planets are revolving around, into the photosphere, and changes that a little bit, just slightly, which causes increased production of solar activity during our maximum cycle. And this is very consistent. So we know that Jupiter plays a role in modulating the sun. We also know that those large giant planets like Uranus, Neptune, they play a huge role, especially Saturn, in modulating the inner planets and their positioning and their activity. So like I described before, Earth has these foot point connections. They don't go straight to the sun. They arc out, come back in towards the sun through this ballerina skirts kind of effect of the solar wind sheet. So what we're looking at is different conjunctions. So for example, we have oppositions, superior conjunctions. We have trines, sextants, different angles that we can calculate. These are geometric configurations that the planets will fall into. And once they fall into those patterns of a conjunction or opposition, that affects the energy distribution. Again, like a radio transponder and a radio receiver, if you put something in between those two, it causes interference and disturbance between the signal reaching its source. And it's the same way with the planets and the sun. Any disruption in between those bodies causes a static. The signal's not as clear, or the energy is being disturbed or modulated or attenuated. So there's something that's taking place with these sacred geometric angles that the planets are forming, and that has an effect on the inner planets and causes this disturbance, which in turn causes different disturbances within the chromosphere of the sun itself. So you're going to see the sunspots start to form, the spicules spreading, the coronal holes opening up, and this is part of the solar cycle, and it's also part of the modulation that's taking place by the planets, which of course modulates the solar cycle. And then of course there's precession, the longer count cycle, which is where our North Star changes in relative to our position, because we're moving. The whole entire solar system is moving all together. And of course, this movement will bring us into different regions of space that have more debris or less debris, or different direction of the hydrogen flow. And that's just where we're located within the Milky Way. As we move through, we come closer to the bow shock region of the Milky Way that's moving one direction. So one other interesting thing, when we look up at the night sky, we don't see the Milky Way on a plane of equatorial gradient. Instead, it appears to be on its side, as if it's tipped. And the reason for that is, and we're going to go into this later in discussion, but it has come to the understanding that two galaxies merged, Sagittarius and the Milky Way. And we call Sagittarius A the center of the Milky Way right now. And Sagittarius B is the constellation we're all familiar with, the remnants of what wasn't cannibalized by the Milky Way. So it appears that we were captured in a capture scenario where some of these planets were merged into the solar system that was already here. And that's what the evidence appears to be showing. So that we'll go into more detail later. It's called the Saturn myth story. It was handed down by Aboriginals and even Egyptians. Some of the oldest mythologies that we have are stating this very odd scenario, I would say, in mythology. But it seems to make a lot of sense, and we have evidence here that collaborates with that and confirms a lot of those beliefs could be indeed be true. So we'll take a closer look at that later, as well as the precessional cycles and what triggers our 100,000 year ice age. We technically only had 9 of those. There's no ice samples or evidence for an ice age beyond 1,000,000 years. So there's something that's taken place. Earth's time's changed about 3 AU distance. So we've had more days in the year. We've had 365 days